The words hit Knight Rider like a bullet through the chest, freezing him mid-stride as he carried fresh venison toward his campfire in the Wyoming wilderness. And when he turned to face the source of that trembling voice, he found a woman so thin she looked like a ghost made flesh, clutching a small girl whose lips had turned the color of winter sky. Knight Rider of the Blackfoot Nation had chosen this isolated canyon specifically because it kept him away from the complications that came with people, white settlers especially, who'd spent the last decade pushing his people further west with broken treaties and empty promises. The woman stood at the edge of his camp, her dress torn and mud-stained, feet wrapped in what looked like strips of cloth that had once been a petticoat, now soaked through with blood that left dark prints in the snow behind her. She swayed on those ruined feet, one arm wrapped protectively around a little girl who couldn't have been more than 6 years old, the child's face pressed against. Her mother sighed in a way that spoke of too many cold nights and not enough food. "Please," the woman said again, her voice cracking on the single word, and Knight Rider could see the effort it took for her to remain standing, to keep her chin lifted despite the obvious agony of every breath she drew. The little girl peeked out from behind her mother's skirt, with eyes too large for her gaunt face, and Knight Rider felt something twist in his chest at the sight of a child in such condition, her small hands wrapped in the same makeshift cloth bandages as her mother's feet. "We don't mean no harm," the woman continued, her words tumbling out in a rush as if she feared he might disappear before she could finish speaking. "I know you got no reason to trust white folk, and Lord knows my people have given yours every reason to turn away, but my Ruby, she's so cold she can't feel her hands no more. And I'm afraid if we don't get warm soon—" She broke off, her whole body shuddering with exhaustion and cold and fear that Knight Rider recognized from his own memories of fleeing soldiers, of watching his people scattered and broken by forces they couldn't fight. Knight Rider set down his venison carefully, his eyes never leaving the woman and child as he assessed them with the practiced gaze of a warrior who'd learned to read threats and desperation with equal accuracy. The woman wasn't armed. That much was clear from the way her dress hung on her frame, with no bulges that might hide a weapon. And the child looked barely conscious, her small face pale, except for 2 spots of unnatural color high on her cheeks, that Knight Rider recognized as the dangerous flush of fever setting in. "How long you been walking?" he asked, his voice coming out rougher than intended from disuse, weeks alone in the wilderness having stripped away the need for speech. The woman blinked at him, surprise flickering across her face as if she hadn't expected him to speak English, which told Knight Rider everything he needed to know about the kind of white settlers she'd encountered before. "3 days. She whispered, and her voice broke on the words like ice, cracking under too much weight. "Maybe 4. I lost track. After the second night when Ruby stopped asking how much further we had to go, Knight Rider felt his jaw tighten at the image her words painted. A woman and small child walking through early winter wilderness for days without proper supplies or shelter. And he found himself wondering what kind of desperation could drive someone to such extremes. "Mama's feet hurt real bad," the little girl, Ruby, spoke up suddenly, her voice so soft Knight Rider had to strain to hear it. "But she says we gotta keep walking, 'cause the bad men might still be following us." The woman's hand immediately covered her daughter's mouth, panic flashing across her face in a way that made Knight Rider's warrior instincts flare with alertness. "Ruby, hush now," the woman said sharply, then softened her tone when she saw her daughter's eyes fill with tears. "Mama told you we don't talk about that. Remember, we talked about keeping our secrets safe." Knight Rider studied them both with renewed interest, noting the way the woman's eyes kept darting back toward the canyon entrance, as if expecting pursuit, the protective way she positioned herself between her child and any potential threat, the haunted quality in her expression that spoke of recent trauma. "Sit," he said finally, gesturing toward the fire that crackled and popped with comforting warmth. "Get the child near the heat, before she loses fingers to frostbite." The woman's legs gave out completely at his words, as if permission to stop moving had released whatever force of will had been holding her upright, and she sank to her knees in the snow with a sound that was half sob, half prayer. "Thank you," she gasped, tears streaming down her face as she tried to crawl toward the fire while still supporting her daughter. Thank you. I didn't know if anyone would help us, didn't know if we'd make it through another night." Knight Rider moved to help, before he'd consciously decided to do so, his hands gentle as he lifted the small girl and carried her toward the warmth. Feeling how light she was, how her body shook with cold that had settled deep into her bones. Ruby didn't protest being carried by a stranger, which told Knight Rider that the child had been pushed far beyond normal fear into a state of exhausted acceptance that made his heart ache with memories of other children he'd seen broken by circumstances beyond their control. He settled Ruby on his own sleeping furs near the fire, noting how her teeth chattered so hard she couldn't speak, how her small hands were indeed without feeling when he touched them, the skin gone white and waxy in a way that required immediate attention. The woman had managed to crawl to the fire's edge, and Knight Rider could see now the full extent of her condition, the way her dress hung on a frame that had clearly lost significant weight recently, the hollow quality to her cheeks that spoke of weeks without proper food, the purple shadows under her eyes that told of sleepless nights filled with fear. "What's your name?" Knight Rider asked, as he began unwrapping Ruby's hands with careful efficiency, checking for signs of severe frostbite that might require more drastic measures. "Caroline Walsh," the woman said, then hesitated before adding, "but most folks call me Carrie, and this here's my daughter Ruby. She's 6 years old, and the bravest little girl you ever did meet." Knight Rider glanced at the child, who was starting to whimper as feeling began returning to her hands in painful waves, and he saw the way she bit her lip to keep from crying out, the fierce determination in her young eyes that reminded him of his own sister at that age. "I'm called Knight Rider," he said simply, not offering his Blackfoot name because that was sacred and not for sharing with strangers. "No matter how desperate, and I'm going to help warm your daughter before we deal with your feet." Carrie's hand went to her mouth, fresh tears spilling over, as if the simple acknowledgement that her feet needed attention had broken through some final barrier of denial she'd been maintaining. "They're bad, aren't they?" she said, not a question but a statement of fact she'd been avoiding facing. "I can't feel them anymore, haven't been able to since yesterday morning, but I couldn't stop walking because Ruby needs her mother alive." Knight Rider interrupted firmly, his hands continuing their efficient work of warming the child's fingers while he spoke. "Which means we deal with the frostbite before infection sets in and takes the choice away from all of us." Ruby's whimper grew louder as the pain of returning circulation intensified, and Carrie immediately pulled her daughter close, despite her own obvious agony, making soothing sounds while stroking the child's hair with trembling hands. "You're so brave, baby girl," Carrie murmured, her voice thick with tears and love and exhaustion. "And just a little longer, Mama promises we're safe now. This good man is going to help us." Knight Rider felt something uncomfortable shift in his chest at being called a good man by someone who had every reason to distrust any man, let alone one, from a people her own kind had been systematically destroying for decades. He'd chosen isolation specifically to avoid these kinds of complications, to escape the weight of other people's suffering and the impossible choices that came with caring about anyone beyond himself. After losing his wife and infant son to a cavalry raid 5 years ago, Knight Rider had walked away from what remained of his scattered people, unable to bear the constant grief, the endless cycle of loss and retribution that defined life on the shrinking frontier. He'd built this solitary existence in the canyon, where white settlers rarely ventured and other tribes respected his need for isolation, hunting and trapping and trying to forget that he'd once been a husband and father, that he'd once believed in futures worth fighting for. But looking at Ruby's pale face and Carrie's desperate determination to protect her child despite impossible odds, Knight Rider felt the walls he'd carefully constructed around his heart beginning to crack in ways that both terrified and compelled him. "The child's hands will be fine," he said after a few more minutes of careful examination. "Painful for a few days, but no permanent damage if we keep them warm and dry." He turned his attention to Carrie then, noting how she'd positioned herself to hide her feet from view, as if shame could somehow make the damage less real. "Let me see," he said gently, moving closer with the kind of slow deliberation he'd use approaching a wounded animal, someone who might bolt if startled, despite having nowhere left to run. Carrie hesitated, her hands twisting in her lap with nervous energy that spoke of deeply ingrained training about propriety and what was proper for a woman to allow. "Mama, please," Ruby whispered, her small voice carrying the weight of a child who'd been forced to become far too adult, far too soon. "Let the hunter help you like you helped me." The simple logic of a 6-year-old broke through Carrie's hesitation, and she slowly extended her legs toward Knight Rider, wincing as movement awakened pain she'd been suppressing through sheer force of will. Knight Rider began unwrapping the makeshift bandages with hands that had delivered babies and closed the eyes of the dying, that had learned gentleness from his wife and violence from necessity, that now trembled slightly with anger at what he found beneath the blood-soaked cloth. Carrie's feet were a ruin of torn flesh and exposed bone in places, frostbite having turned her toes black in several places, infection clearly setting in around wounds that had been walked on far too long without treatment. How did this happen? Knight Rider asked, his voice carefully controlled to hide the rage building in his chest. Rage, not at this woman, but at whatever circumstances had driven her to such extremes. Carrie was quiet for a long moment, her eyes fixed on her daughter rather than the man tending her wounds, and when she finally spoke, her voice carried the flat quality of someone reciting facts too painful for emotion. "My husband died 6 months back," she began, each word seeming to cost her something precious. "Got himself killed in a mining accident that the company said was his own fault. So they didn't pay out nothing to me and Ruby." She paused, swallowing hard before continuing. "I tried to make it work, took in washing and mending, but it wasn't enough to keep the room we was renting and the landlord. He said I could stay if I was willing to provide certain services." Knight Rider's hands stilled on her feet, understanding flooding through him at what she wasn't quite saying directly. The kind of proposition that desperate women face daily in frontier towns, where men outnumbered women 10 to 1. "I told him no," Carrie continued, her voice gaining strength with fierce pride. "I told him I'd rather sleep in the street than sell myself that way, and he said that was fine by him, but I was taking my bastard daughter with me when I went." Ruby made a small sound of distress at the word bastard, and Carrie immediately reached for her daughter's hand in silent apology for letting the ugly term slip out. "We managed for a while," Carrie went on, her narrative picking up momentum now, as if confession had opened floodgates she could no longer close. "Sleeping in the church when the minister would let us, doing odd jobs for food. But then winter started coming early, and I knew we couldn't survive on the streets." Knight Rider resumed his work on her feet, cleaning wounds with water he'd heated over the fire while she talked, his silence an invitation for her to continue at her own pace. "There was a man," Carrie said, and Knight Rider heard the way her voice changed, going hard and bitter in a way that made his warrior instincts flare with alertness. "Said his name was Jacob Brennan. Claimed he ran an orphanage 2 towns over that could take Ruby in. Give her proper food and schooling and a warm bed." She laughed then, a sound completely devoid of humor that made Ruby press closer to her mother's side. "I was desperate enough to believe him. Carrie continued, tears sliding down her cheeks unchecked. Desperate enough to think maybe Ruby would be better off without me, that I was being selfish keeping her with me when she was cold and hungry all the time. Knight Rider could see where this story was heading, could feel the rage building in his chest at the predictable cruelty of men who preyed on desperate women and vulnerable children. "It wasn't no orphanage," Carrie said flatly, her voice going dead in a way that Knight Rider recognized from his own people's stories of betrayal and broken promises. It was a work camp, children brought in under false pretenses and kept there doing factory labor for 14 hours a day with barely enough food to keep them standing. Ruby whimpered at the memory, and Carrie pulled her daughter close with fierce protectiveness. "I didn't know until I went to visit her after a month," Carrie said. "They'd told me no visits for the first month while Ruby adjusted. But something felt wrong, so I went anyway, and what I found—" Her voice broke completely then, sobs shaking her thin frame as memory overwhelmed carefully maintained composure. "My baby girl was skin and bones," Carrie gasped. Bruises all over from where they'd hit her for working too slow. Her hands bleeding from handling machinery no child should be near. And when she saw me, she started crying and begging me not to leave her there again. Knight Rider felt his hands clench into fists, had to consciously force them to relax so he didn't hurt Carrie's already damaged feet. The rage in his chest threatening to consume his carefully maintained emotional distance. "I took her," Carrie said fiercely. "Didn't care that it was stealing according to the law. Didn't care that Brennan owned her contract that I'd signed in my desperation. I just grabbed my daughter and ran." She met Knight Rider's eyes directly for the first time since beginning her story, and he saw the fierce maternal love that had driven her to walk herself nearly to death, rather than let anyone take her child again. "He's been hunting us ever since," Carrie finished quietly, her gaze dropping back to Ruby's sleeping form, exhaustion having finally claimed the child, despite the pain of her warming hands. "They got men working for him who'll do anything for money. And they've been tracking us across 3 territories, always just a day or two behind." Knight Rider sat back on his heels, processing everything she'd told him while his mind raced through implications and complications he'd been trying to avoid for 5 years of self-imposed isolation. Taking in this woman and child, even temporarily, would mean involving himself in exactly the kind of human drama he'd fled into the wilderness to escape. But looking at Ruby's pale face, at the fierce determination in Carrie's eyes, despite her body's obvious collapse, at the evidence of a mother's love that had driven her to impossible extremes, Knight Rider felt something he thought had died with his wife and son beginning to stir back to life. "You can stay," he heard himself saying, the words coming out rough with disuse and emotion he didn't want to examine too closely, "until your feet heal enough to walk again, until the child regains her strength." Carrie's face crumpled with relief so profound it was painful to witness, her hands covering her mouth as sobs of gratitude and exhaustion shook her entire body. "But we need to be clear about something," Knight Rider continued, his voice taking on the hard edge of someone stating non-negotiable terms. "If these men tracking you are as determined as you say, they'll find this canyon eventually, and when they do, there will be violence." He met Carrie's eyes with the directness of a warrior, stating brutal truths. "I won't let them take the child," Knight Rider said simply, "which means I'll have to kill anyone who tries, and that blood will be on both our hands." Carrie wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, her chin lifting with the same stubborn pride that had carried her through 3 days of walking on ruined feet. "Then I guess we'll both have blood on our hands," she said quietly, reaching out to stroke Ruby's hair with infinite gentleness. "Because I'd rather die fighting than let them put my daughter back in that hell." Knight Rider nodded once, acknowledging the pact they'd just made without fully understanding all its implications, knowing only that something fundamental had shifted in his carefully isolated existence. As he returned to tending Carrie's feet, cleaning and bandaging wounds that would take weeks to heal properly, Knight Rider felt the walls he'd built around his heart continuing to crack. He'd chosen isolation to escape the pain of caring, to avoid the inevitable loss that seemed to follow everyone he allowed himself to love. But perhaps, he thought, as Ruby stirred in her sleep and Carrie's hand found her daughter's with instinctive protectiveness, perhaps some things were worth the risk of pain. Perhaps some battles were worth fighting even when you'd sworn to walk away from war. The fire crackled and popped, casting dancing shadows across the canyon walls, while wind whistled through the rocks above. And Knight Rider realized that his solitary existence had just come to an irrevocable end. Morning came to the canyon, with the harsh clarity of winter sunlight reflecting off snow. And Knight Rider woke to a sound he hadn't heard in 5 years. The soft humming of a woman going about domestic tasks as if such normalcy still existed in a world that had tried its best to crush her spirit. He'd spent the night sitting upright against a boulder, his rifle across his knees and his senses tuned to every sound that might signal approaching danger. Years of survival instinct refusing to let him sleep deeply, even when exhaustion pulled at his consciousness. Carrie had fallen into fevered sleep shortly after he'd finished bandaging her feet, her body finally surrendering to the damage she'd inflicted on it through 3 days of relentless walking. And he'd covered her and Ruby with his spare furs while taking first watch, now impossibly. She was awake and attempting to move around the camp, despite feet that should have kept her immobile for weeks. Her jaw set with determination that Knight Rider recognized as both admirable and dangerously foolish. "What are you doing?" he asked, his voice coming out sharper than intended as he watched her limp toward his supplies with movements that clearly cost her significant pain. Carrie startled at his voice, nearly losing her balance before catching herself against a rock outcropping. And when she turned to face him, her cheeks flushed with embarrassment that seemed out of place given everything she'd survived. "Making myself useful," she said, lifting her chin with that stubborn pride he was beginning to recognize as her default response to vulnerability. "You gave us shelter and warmth and probably saved Ruby's life. Least I can do is prepare a proper breakfast." Knight Rider stood, his joints protesting the night spent in one position, and crossed to where she stood with the kind of purposeful stride that made her take an involuntary step backward. "You can make yourself useful by staying off those feet," he said firmly, taking the coffee pot from her hands with movements that were gentle despite his gruff tone. "Infection is already setting in, and if you push too hard too fast, you'll lose toes or worse." Carrie's face went pale at his words, her hand reaching instinctively toward where Ruby still slept peacefully by the fire, and Knight Rider saw the calculation happening behind her eyes, weighing the cost of permanent injury against her need to not be a burden. "I can't just lie there being useless," Carrie whispered, her voice breaking on the admission. "I've got to earn our keep somehow. Got to prove we're worth the trouble of helping." The desperation in her tone made Knight Rider pause, recognition flooding through him at the psychology of someone who'd learned that survival depended on constantly proving their value to others. "You're not a servant," he said quietly, surprising himself with the gentleness that crept into his voice. "And this isn't a transaction where you owe me labor in exchange for basic human decency." Carrie blinked at him, confusion crossing her face, as if the concept of help without strings attached was so foreign she couldn't quite process it. "I don't understand," she said finally, her hands twisting in the fabric of her torn dress. "Everyone wants something, even people who seem kind at first. They always want something eventually." Knight Rider felt something cold settle in his chest at the worldview her words revealed. A lifetime of betrayals and disappointments that had taught her to distrust kindness as a precursor to exploitation. "I want you to sit down and let your feet heal," he said simply, gesturing toward the furs by the fire. "And I want your daughter to wake up warm and fed instead of cold and hungry. That's the extent of what I want from you." Carrie studied his face with the intensity of someone who'd learned to read lies in men's expressions. searching for the hidden agenda that her experience told her must exist somewhere beneath his words. Whatever she saw in his eyes must have satisfied some internal test, because she finally nodded and allowed him to help her back to the sleeping area, though her body remained tense with the expectation of demands that would surely come eventually. Ruby stirred as her mother settled beside her, small hands reaching out instinctively to ensure Carrie's presence before the child's eyes even opened fully. "Mama!" Ruby's voice was rough with sleep and lingering illness, but stronger than it had been the night before, warming and rest having already begun their healing work. "I'm right here, baby girl," Carrie murmured, pulling her daughter close with the fierce protectiveness that Knight Rider was beginning to understand defined every aspect of her existence. "We're safe, and the kind hunter is going to make us breakfast." Ruby's eyes found Knight Rider across the camp, studying him with the solemn evaluation that children applied to new adults in their lives, deciding whether this stranger represented safety or threat. "You're really tall," Ruby observed after a moment, her childish directness cutting through the tension that adults built with their complicated histories and broken trust. "Taller than Papa was, and you got really long hair." Knight Rider felt an unexpected smile tug at his mouth, the first genuine expression of amusement he'd experienced in longer than he could remember. "My people don't cut their hair except in mourning," he explained, keeping his voice gentle as he prepared coffee and began heating jerky and roots for their breakfast. "It's part of who we are." Ruby considered this information with the seriousness children brought to learning new facts about their world. They nodded, as if his explanation made perfect sense to her 6-year-old logic. "Mama cuts my hair sometimes 'cause it gets tangly," Ruby offered, apparently deciding Knight Rider had passed whatever test she'd been conducting. "But I wish I could grow it really long like yours." Carrie's hand smoothed her daughter's hair with automatic maternal affection, and Knight Rider caught the shine of tears in her eyes at hearing Ruby engage in normal childhood conversation after weeks of survival mode that had stripped away such innocent exchanges. "Once your mama's feet are healed," Knight Rider heard himself saying before he'd fully thought through the implications, "I'll teach you how to braid your hair the way Blackfoot women do. Keeps it from tangling but lets it grow long." The promise hung in the air between them, a commitment that extended far beyond the temporary shelter he'd initially offered. And he saw understanding flash across Carrie's face, along with something that might have been hope mixed with fear. "That's very kind," Carrie said carefully, her tone suggesting she was testing the boundaries of his offer. "But we wouldn't want to impose for that long. Once I can walk properly, we'll move on and let you get back to your solitude." Knight Rider poured coffee into tin cups with movements that had become ritual over years of solitary living, considering how to respond to the implicit question in her statement. "Winter's coming hard," he said finally, keeping his eyes on the practical task rather than the emotional implications of what he was suggesting. "These mountains become impassable once the deep snows hit, and you're in no condition to travel for weeks, even if the weather held." He handed her a cup of coffee, their fingers brushing briefly in the exchange, and he felt her flinch at the contact before consciously relaxing. "Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you." "What I'm saying is you'll be staying here until spring thaw at minimum," Knight Rider continued, settling cross-legged near the fire with his own cup. "Which means we might as well figure out how to make the arrangement work for everyone, instead of pretending it's temporary." Ruby had been listening to this exchange with the focused attention children applied to adult conversations about their futures, and now she spoke up with the blunt honesty only children could manage. "Does that mean we get to stay in the canyon with you all winter?" she asked, her eyes lighting up with excitement at the prospect. "Will you teach me other stuff too, like how to track animals and read the stars like Mama says Indians can do?" "Ruby," Carrie's voice carried a sharp warning, her face flushing with embarrassment at her daughter's casual use of a term she'd been taught was disrespectful. We don't say Indians, it's rude." Knight Rider held up a hand, stopping her mid-apology with a gesture that was firm but not unkind. "The child means no disrespect," he said quietly. "She's just using the words she's been taught, and yes, Ruby, I can teach you to track and read stars if your mother agrees." He met Carrie's eyes directly, seeing the war happening behind them between maternal protectiveness and the recognition that her daughter needed skills beyond what she alone could provide. "I'll teach her other things too," Knight Rider continued, warming to the idea even as part of him rebelled against getting this involved in their lives. How to find water in drought, which plants heal and which poison. How to move through wilderness without leaving traces. His voice took on an edge of steel as he added, "Skills that might save her life if men come hunting again, and she needs to disappear into country where they can't follow." The reminder of the threat hanging over them cast a shadow across the morning's tentative warmth, and Carrie's hand tightened protectively around Ruby's small shoulder. "You think they'll find us here?" she said. "Not a question, but a statement of grim certainty. You think it's just a matter of time?" Knight Rider didn't insult her intelligence by offering false comfort or empty reassurances that everything would be fine. "Men like this, Brennan, don't give up easily on things they consider their property," he said bluntly, watching Ruby to ensure his words weren't causing unnecessary fear in the child. "And winter will slow but not stop determined trackers," he paused, choosing his next words carefully because they would define the nature of the protection he was offering. "But this canyon has only one entrance that's passable on horseback," Knight Rider continued, his voice taking on the quality of a warrior discussing battlefield strategy. "And I know this country better than any white tracker they could hire, which gives us advantages if we use them wisely." Carrie's face had gone pale again, but her chin lifted with that stubborn courage he was coming to admire, despite his best efforts to remain emotionally distant. "What do you need me to do?" she asked simply, accepting that safety required preparation rather than hoping danger might pass them by. "I can shoot a rifle if that's what it takes, though I'm not very good at it." Knight Rider shook his head, not dismissing her offer but redirecting it toward more practical applications. "Right now I need you to heal," he said firmly. "A wounded woman can't run or fight if things go bad, and Ruby needs at least one parent capable of getting her to safety." The casual reference to himself as a parent figure made them both pause, the word hanging between them with implications neither seemed quite ready to examine. Ruby, oblivious to the adult undercurrents, had begun exploring the camp with the curious energy of a child who'd been given permission to feel safe enough for investigation. "What's this?" she called out, having discovered Knight Rider's collection of carved wooden figures arranged on a flat rock near his sleeping area. Knight Rider felt his chest tighten at the innocent question, those figures representing the only remaining connection to the family he'd lost and the life he'd tried to leave behind. "Those are spirit animals," he said quietly, watching Ruby's small hands hover over the carvings without quite touching them, showing an instinctive respect that surprised him. "Each one represents something important. Protection or courage or wisdom." Ruby pointed to a small wolf carved with exquisite detail, its head tilted as if listening to sounds beyond human hearing. "Is this one you?" she asked with the intuitive leap children made connecting symbols to reality. "Because you're called Knight Rider and wolves hunt at night?" The observation was so accurate it made Knight Rider's breath catch, that particular carving having been made years ago when he still believed in futures worth planning for. "That's the wolf that runs with the night wind," he said, the words coming from half-forgotten stories his grandmother had told him as a child. "It protects travelers who've lost their way and guides them towards safety." Carrie had moved closer, drawn by her daughter's fascination and the rare glimpse into Knight Rider's inner world that the carvings represented. "They're beautiful," she said softly, her artist's eye appreciating the skill and patience required to create such detailed work. "Did you make all of these yourself?" Knight Rider nodded, uncomfortable with the vulnerability of having strangers see these private pieces of his soul made manifest in wood. "It passes the time during long winters," he said dismissively, trying to minimize the significance of creations that had kept him connected to his culture and identity through years of isolation. "It gives my hands something to do besides hold weapons." But Carrie wasn't fooled by his casual tone, her eyes moving across the collection with growing understanding of what the carvings represented. "This one's newer," she observed, pointing to a figure that stood apart from the others. A woman holding a child carved with such tenderness that it made Knight Rider's throat constrict. "You made this recently?" He had carved it just last week, driven by dreams of his wife and son that had been growing more vivid lately, as if their spirits were trying to tell him something he'd been refusing to hear. "Sometimes the dead visit us in dreams," Knight Rider said finally, his voice rougher than intended. "And making their images helps honor their memory." The silence that followed his words was heavy with shared grief. Carrie's own losses written in the lines around her eyes, and the way she held Ruby, just a fraction too tightly. "I dream about my husband sometimes," Carrie admitted quietly, surprising herself as much as Knight Rider with the confession. "But they're not good dreams. They're memories of all the times I wanted to leave but didn't. All the times I chose his promises over my daughter's safety." Her voice broke on the last words. Years of guilt and self-recrimination flooding to the surface despite her obvious efforts to maintain composure. Knight Rider recognized the familiar pattern of survivor's guilt. The way people tortured themselves with imaginary choices they might have made differently, with information they couldn't have possessed at the time. "The past can't be changed," he said firmly, speaking to his own demons as much as hers, "only honored or learned from. Dwelling on what might have been different is a trap that keeps you from seeing what is." Carrie wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, embarrassed by the emotional display in front of someone who'd shown her nothing but practical kindness. "I'm sorry," she murmured. "You didn't sign up for a weeping woman and her damaged daughter disrupting your peace." Knight Rider felt anger flash through him at her self-deprecating words, the casual way she dismissed her own worth and Ruby's resilience. "Your daughter isn't damaged," he said sharply, making both Carrie and Ruby look at him with startled attention. "She's strong and brave and smarter than most adults I've known." He paused, moderating his tone but not his conviction as he continued, "And neither are you damaged. You're a woman who survived impossible circumstances and protected your child through situations that would have broken weaker people." Carrie stared at him with an expression that suggested no one had ever spoken to her that way before, offering validation without expectation of anything in return. "I don't feel strong," she whispered, her hands twisting in her lap with nervous energy. "I feel like I'm barely holding together, like one more bad thing will shatter me completely." Knight Rider moved closer, his movements slow and deliberate to avoid startling her, and when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of personal experience with the darkness she described. "Strength isn't the absence of breaking," he said quietly. "It's continuing to move forward even after you've shattered into pieces. It's protecting what matters, even when you're not sure you can protect yourself." His eyes found Ruby, who had returned to examining the carved figures with absorbed fascination, and something in his chest loosened at the sight of a child feeling safe enough to be curious rather than constantly vigilant. "You walked for 3 days on feet that should have stopped you after 3 hours," Knight Rider continued, returning his attention to Carrie. "You fled a situation where staying might have been easier, but would have destroyed your daughter's spirit." He reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away if she needed to, and gently lifted her chin until she met his eyes directly. "That's not weakness," he said with absolute conviction. "That's the kind of courage warriors spend their whole lives trying to achieve." Carrie's eyes filled with tears again. But these were different from the earlier ones, born of relief at being seen and valued rather than shame at being judged. "Thank you," she breathed, The words inadequate for the gift he'd just given her, but all she could manage around the emotion clogging her throat. Knight Rider released her chin and stepped back, uncomfortable with the intensity of the moment and the way it was making him feel things he'd sworn to keep buried. Ruby chose that moment to provide a distraction, holding up the wolf carving with obvious reverence and a question that cut straight to the heart of what was building between the three of them. "Mr. Knight Rider," she said solemnly, her young face serious with the importance of what she was asking, "if this wolf protects people who are lost, does that mean you're going to protect me and Mama?" The question hung in the cold morning air, demanding an answer that would commit him to far more than temporary shelter or practical assistance. Knight Rider met the child's eyes, seeing trust and hope and the desperate need for an adult who would mean what he promised. Then he looked at Carrie, seeing the same desperate hope tempered by the expectation of eventual disappointment that life had taught her to anticipate. "Yes," he heard himself say, the single word carrying the weight of an oath. "I'm going to protect both of you for as long as you need protecting." Ruby's face lit up with joy, so pure it made Knight Rider's chest ache with memories of his own son's laughter, and she immediately launched herself at him in an exuberant hug that caught him completely off guard. He stood frozen for a moment, unused to physical affection after years of solitude, then slowly brought his arms around the small body pressed against him with the fierce trust only children could offer. Over Ruby's head, Knight Rider's eyes met Carrie's, and he saw tears streaming down her face, mixed with something that might have been the first stirrings of hope that maybe, impossibly, they'd found safety that wouldn't be snatched away. "Thank you," Carrie mouthed silently, and Knight Rider nodded in acknowledgement of the responsibility he'd just accepted. As Ruby chatted excitedly about all the things she wanted to learn, and Carrie allowed herself to relax for the first time in months, Knight Rider felt the walls around his heart continuing to crumble. He'd thought isolation would protect him from the pain of loss, but these two people had shown him in less than a day that some things were worth the risk of caring again. The morning sun climbed higher, warming the canyon and driving back the night's cold. And Knight Rider began teaching Ruby her first lesson in tracking, while Carrie watched with maternal pride. None of them noticed the single set of boot prints in the snow at the canyon's entrance, evidence that they'd already been found. The scream that shattered the afternoon's peaceful rhythm came from Ruby, her small voice cutting through the canyon like a knife blade across glass. And Knight Rider was moving before his conscious mind had fully processed the sound. Rifle in hand and every warrior instinct screaming danger, he found the child standing at the canyon's narrow entrance, her small body frozen in terror as she stared at something in the snow that made Knight Rider's blood run cold with recognition and fury. Bootprints, at least 3 different sets, circling the perimeter of his camp in a pattern that spoke of reconnaissance rather than chance encounter. And worse, drag marks where someone had clearly been examining his supplies and equipment while they slept. "Ruby, get back to your mother now," Knight Rider commanded, his voice carrying the kind of absolute authority that made the child obey without question, despite her terror. Carrie appeared at the camp's edge, moving faster than her injured feet should have allowed, maternal instinct overriding pain as she pulled Ruby into her arms with shaking hands. "They found us," Carrie whispered, her face draining of color as understanding crashed through the fragile sense of safety they'd built over the past 2 days. "God help us. They actually found us already." Knight Rider was already moving through the canyon with the practiced efficiency of a hunter reading signs, his eyes cataloging every detail that told the story of their unwelcome visitors. 3 men, all wearing boots made by the same manufacturer, which suggested they worked together rather than being random trappers. And they'd been here sometime during the early morning hours, while Knight Rider had finally allowed himself to sleep deeply for the first time since Carrie and Ruby arrived. The realization that he'd let his guard down at exactly the wrong moment sent rage and self-recrimination flooding through him in equal measure. "How long ago?" Carrie asked, having followed him despite his silent command to stay back. Her voice steady, despite the fear he could see in her white-knuckled grip on Ruby. 4 hours, maybe 5, Knight Rider said grimly, his fingers tracing the edges of the boot prints with professional assessment. They circled the camp, counted our supplies, probably watched us sleep. He paused, his jaw clenching as he found something that made his warrior's blood run even colder. A small cloth doll lying in the snow just beyond the camp's perimeter, clearly dropped there deliberately as a message, and when Carrie saw it, her gasp of recognition told Knight Rider everything he needed to know. "That's Ruby's," Carrie breathed, her hands going to her mouth as the implications crashed through her. "She lost it at the work camp when I took her. I didn't even know she still had it until Brennan's men—" She couldn't finish the sentence. But she didn't need to, because Knight Rider understood the psychological warfare being employed. They'd been to the camp, seen the child sleeping. It could have taken her at any moment, but chose instead to leave evidence of how close they'd come. How vulnerable the small family was despite Knight Rider's protection. "Why didn't they just take us?" Ruby whispered, her small voice breaking on the question that had no good answer. "Why would they come so close and then leave?" Knight Rider knelt beside the child, his expression gentle despite the fury burning in his chest at men who would terrorize a 6-year-old as tactical strategy. "Because they want your mother scared," he said honestly, having learned long ago that children deserved truth appropriate to their understanding. Scared people make mistakes, and mistakes make them easier to catch. Carrie's laugh was bitter and sharp, cutting through the cold air with the sound of someone who'd been pushed beyond the capacity for pretense. "Well, it's working," she said flatly, her hands shaking as she held Ruby tighter. "I'm terrified, and I don't know what to do except run again. But my feet won't carry me, and Ruby's not strong enough yet for another journey." Knight Rider stood, his mind already racing through tactical options with the calculating precision of someone who'd survived countless battles through superior strategy rather than superior numbers. "We don't run," he said firmly, his voice carrying the kind of conviction that demanded belief. "Running is what they expect. What they're prepared for." He met Carrie's eyes directly, seeing the war between hope and despair playing across her face. "We turn this canyon into a trap," Knight Rider continued, his words taking on the quality of a warrior laying out battle plans. 3 men against 1 might seem like good odds to them, but they don't know this territory, and they don't know who they're actually facing. Carrie shook her head, fear making her voice rise with desperate logic that came from months of running. "You don't understand what Brennan's like," she insisted, her free hand gesturing frantically as if she could make him comprehend through sheer force of will. "He's got resources, connections, men who'll do anything for money." She paused, swallowing hard before continuing. "Even if you stop these 3, he'll just send more, and more after that, until we're either dead or back under his control." Knight Rider felt something cold and hard settle in his chest, the same feeling he'd experienced before every battle during his years as a warrior, when peace had failed and violence became the only language enemies understood. "Then I'll kill every man he sends," Knight Rider said quietly, his voice carrying absolute conviction that made even Carrie stop her frantic protests, "until he understands that some prey is too dangerous to hunt." Ruby looked between the 2 adults, her young face showing comprehension beyond her years about the reality they were discussing. "You're going to fight the bad men," she said solemnly, not a question but a statement of fact. "Like the warriors in the stories Mama tells me about, brave people who protect others." Knight Rider felt his throat tighten at the child's innocent faith in heroic narratives, knowing that real violence was nothing like the sanitized stories told to children. "Yes," he said simply, "because she deserved honesty even if the truth was harsh. I'm going to fight them, and I'm going to win because the alternative is unacceptable." Carrie made a small sound of distress, her maternal instinct warring with the pragmatic understanding that they'd run out of options and places to flee. "I can't ask you to risk your life for us," she whispered, tears streaming down her face as the weight of their situation crushed through her careful composure. "We're nothing to you, strangers who appeared 2 days ago. You don't owe us this kind of sacrifice." Knight Rider moved closer, his hands gentle as he took her shoulders and forced her to meet his eyes with the kind of directness that wouldn't allow her to look away. "You're not nothing," he said fiercely, each word carrying the weight of a vow. "You're a woman who risked everything to save her child, and Ruby is an innocent who deserves better than the world has given her." He paused, searching for words to explain something he barely understood himself about why these two people had managed to crack through defenses he'd spent years building. "5 years ago, I lost my wife and son to men who valued land more than lives," Knight Rider continued, his voice rough with old grief that never quite healed. "I walked away from my people because I couldn't stand to watch more death, more suffering, more families torn apart." His hands tightened slightly on Carrie's shoulders. Not enough to hurt, but enough to emphasize the importance of what he was saying. "I thought isolation would protect me from the pain of losing people I cared about," he said quietly. "But these past 2 days have shown me that living without connection isn't protection. It's just a different kind of death." Carrie's eyes searched his face, looking for the truth behind words that seemed too generous to believe after a lifetime of disappointments and betrayals. "You barely know us," she whispered, but there was hope beginning to bloom beneath the protest, fragile and tentative like first flowers after winter. "I know enough," Knight Rider replied simply, releasing her shoulders and stepping back before the intensity of the moment could overwhelm them both. "I know you're brave and Ruby is special, and neither of you deserves what's being done to you." Ruby had been listening with the focused attention children brought to adult conversations about their futures, and now she spoke up with a question that cut straight to the practical heart of their situation. "What do we need to do to help you fight?" she asked seriously, her small face set with determination that would have been amusing if the circumstances weren't so dire. Knight Rider felt unexpected warmth flood through him at the child's courage, the way she immediately thought in terms of cooperation rather than passive waiting for adults to solve problems. "You and your mother are going to hide," he said firmly, already planning the logistics of keeping them safe while he dealt with the threat. "There's a place deeper in the canyon, a cave that's hidden unless you know exactly where to look." He moved to his supplies, pulling out items he'd need for the preparation ahead while continuing to speak. "I'll take you there before dark, get you set up with food and water and furs to keep warm," Knight Rider explained, his hands moving with practiced efficiency. "Then I'm going to make sure these 3 men never report back to Brennan about finding you." Carrie's face had gone pale again, understanding flooding through her about what he was actually proposing. "You're planning to kill them," she said flatly, the words stripped of judgment, but heavy with the weight of that reality. "Not just drive them off or scare them away, but actually kill them." Knight Rider met her eyes without flinching, his expression carrying the hard truth of someone who'd made peace with violence as a necessary tool of survival. "Yes," he said simply, "because men like this don't respond to mercy or warnings. They interpret anything less than death as weakness to be exploited." He paused, giving her time to process before continuing. "If that makes me a monster in your eyes, I understand. But it doesn't change what needs to be done." Carrie was quiet for a long moment, her eyes moving between Knight Rider's face and Ruby's small form, weighing moral complications against maternal necessity. "It doesn't make you a monster," she said finally, her voice steady despite the tears on her cheeks. "It makes you someone willing to do what I couldn't, what I've been too weak or too scared or too bound by rules that don't apply anymore." She wrapped her arms around herself as if holding together pieces that threatened to fall apart. "I spent months trying to find a civilized solution," Carrie continued, bitterness creeping into her tone. "Talked to sheriffs who said they couldn't help without proof. Went to churches who offered prayers but not protection. Begged officials who cared more about paperwork than a child suffering. Her voice rose with each word, years of frustration and helplessness pouring out in a flood she could no longer contain. "So if the only solution left is violence," Carrie said fiercely, meeting Knight Rider's eyes with newfound steel in her own, "then I won't judge you for providing it. I'll thank God someone finally cared enough to act." Knight Rider felt something shift in his chest at her words, recognition of a kindred spirit who'd been pushed beyond the boundaries of conventional morality by circumstances that allowed no gentle options. "Then we understand each other," he said quietly, returning to his preparations with renewed focus. Ruby had been watching this exchange with wide eyes, processing adult realities about violence and protection in ways that would have been disturbing if she hadn't already been forced to mature far beyond her years. "Will it hurt them?" she asked suddenly, her small voice cutting through the tension. "The bad men, when you fight them, will they be scared like they made me scared?" The question revealed layers of trauma beneath Ruby's surface resilience. The desire for her tormentors to experience even a fraction of the terror they'd inflicted on her. Knight Rider knelt beside the child again, his large hands gentle as he took her small ones. "Yes," he said honestly, "because she deserved truth even when it was uncomfortable. They'll be scared and it will hurt, but that's not why I'm doing this." He paused, searching for words to explain the difference between justice and vengeance to a 6-year-old who'd earned the right to both. "I'm fighting them because they're dangerous, and they won't stop hunting you," Knight Rider continued, his voice carrying patient explanation. "Not because I want them to suffer, even though they deserve suffering for what they've done." Ruby considered this distinction with the seriousness she brought to all important matters, then nodded slowly. "Mama says revenge makes us just like the bad people," Ruby said carefully, clearly repeating lessons she'd been taught. "But protecting people we love is different." The casual way she included Knight Rider in the category of people she loved hit him with unexpected force, a reminder that children gave their hearts far more readily than adults who'd learned to guard such gifts carefully. "Your mama's a wise woman," Knight Rider said, his voice rough with emotion he didn't quite know how to process. He stood, returning to his weapon preparation while his mind continued planning the tactical details of the coming confrontation. The 3 men would return, probably tonight under cover of darkness, when they thought surprise would give them advantage. They'd expect to find a sleeping camp, 2 women and a man caught off guard by midnight attack. Instead, they'd find a canyon transformed into a killing ground by someone who'd spent decades learning to turn terrain into weapon. "I need to prepare the canyon," Knight Rider said, his voice taking on the clipped efficiency of someone switching into warrior mode. "Traps, obstacles, things that will slow them down and channel them where I want them," Carrie nodded, her face set with grim determination as she accepted the reality of what was coming. "What can we do to help before you hide us?" she asked, surprising him with her willingness to participate despite her obvious fear. Knight Rider considered, recognizing that giving her tasks would help manage the terror of waiting while also serving practical purpose. "Gather anything you consider essential," he said, his mind already running through lists of necessary supplies. "Warm clothes, the few possessions you brought with you. Anything you'd need to survive alone if something goes wrong." The implication hung heavy between them, the unspoken reality that he might not survive the coming fight, and they'd need to be prepared to flee into wilderness with only what they could carry. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story. Carrie's face went white at the thought, but she nodded and moved to follow his instructions without voicing the fear that Knight Rider could see clearly written in her expression. Ruby followed her mother, but paused to look back at Knight Rider with an intensity that seemed far too old for her young face. "You're going to come back, right?" she asked, vulnerability breaking through her attempted bravery. "You're not going to die like Papa did and leave us alone again?" Knight Rider felt his heart clench at the question. the absolute trust in her voice, despite every adult in her life having previously failed to keep such promises. "I'm going to do everything in my power to come back," he said carefully, refusing to make promises that circumstances beyond his control might break. "And if something does go wrong, I've made sure you and your mother have everything you need to survive." It wasn't the absolute reassurance Ruby wanted, but it was honest, and she seemed to sense that his refusal to offer false certainty was itself a kind of respect. "Okay," Ruby said simply, then surprised him by crossing back and wrapping her small arms around his waist in a fierce hug. "But you have to try really hard to win, because I just started to feel safe again." Knight Rider's arms came around the child automatically, and he felt something crack in his chest at the weight of responsibility her trust represented. Over Ruby's head, his eyes met Carrie's, and he saw his own determination reflected back at him. These people had become his to protect, and he would burn the world before letting anyone drag them back to suffering. As afternoon faded toward evening, Knight Rider worked with silent efficiency to transform his peaceful canyon into something far more dangerous. Tripwires hidden in snow, sharpened stakes concealed beneath deadfall, narrow paths that forced single-file travel through killing zones. All the knowledge he'd accumulated through decades of warfare applied now to protecting the small family sleeping in his hidden cave. When darkness finally fell complete, Knight Rider took his position with rifle and knife, and the cold certainty that some battles couldn't be avoided. The only question was, who would still be standing when morning came? And as the first sounds of approaching horses drifted through the night air, Knight Rider felt a grim smile cross his face. These hunters had no idea they'd just become the prey. The first man died without ever knowing what killed him, Knight Rider's arrow taking him through the throat as he dismounted in the canyon's entrance. And the silence that followed his gurgling collapse was more terrifying to his companions than any war cry could have been. Knight Rider watched from his elevated position as the remaining two men froze in their saddles, their eyes scanning the darkness frantically for the source of the attack, while their hands fumbled for weapons, with the clumsy panic of men who'd expected easy prey. "Johnson's down," the taller man hissed, his voice carrying clearly through the cold night air. "Someone get a torch lit. We can't see nothing in this damn canyon." The second man, younger and clearly less experienced, dismounted with shaking hands and began striking flint for light, not understanding that he was making himself the perfect target. Knight Rider's second arrow caught him in the chest before the torch could catch flame, the impact driving him backward into the snow with a wet thump that echoed off canyon walls. The remaining man, the tall one who'd spoken, finally showed some intelligence by abandoning his horse and diving behind a boulder, his voice rising in a shout that mixed fear with fury. "Brennan said there was just one redskin up here," he yelled, his words revealing both his employer and his fatal assumption about numbers. "Whoever you got helping you, this ain't worth dying over." Knight Rider remained silent, knowing that fear and imagination would do more damage than any response he could offer, letting the man's mind populate the darkness with threats far worse than reality. Minutes stretched like hours as the surviving hunter tried to calculate odds and options from behind his inadequate cover, his breathing audible even from Knight Rider's position 20 yards away. "Look," the man tried again, desperation creeping into his voice as he realized his tactical situation was hopeless. "Brennan's paying us $50 each to bring the woman and kid back. But I'll walk away right now if you let me." Knight Rider shifted position silently, moving through terrain he knew intimately, while the hunter remained pinned by fear and uncertainty. "I got a wife," the man continued, his voice cracking now with genuine terror as he understood that silence meant no mercy was coming. "Kids of my own back in Cheyenne. They need me. I was just doing a job." The mention of children made Knight Rider pause, not from sympathy, but from the bitter irony of a man using family as justification while hunting someone else's child. "Your children will learn that their father died helping enslave innocents. Knight Rider said quietly, his voice seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere as canyon acoustics distorted direction. The hunter spun toward where he thought the voice originated, his revolver firing wildly into darkness, while panic destroyed whatever training he might have possessed. Knight Rider used the muzzle flash to pinpoint exact location, and his third arrow flew true, taking the man through the side where armor couldn't protect and vital organs clustered together. The hunter's scream was short and sharp, cut off as he collapsed against the boulder that had provided such inadequate shelter, his hands clutching at the arrow shaft, with the futile desperation of someone who knew they were already dead. Knight Rider approached carefully despite certainty of his kill, years of survival having taught him that wounded enemies were often more dangerous than healthy ones. The man looked up as Knight Rider's shadow fell across him, moonlight revealing a face younger than his voice had suggested. Probably not yet 30 and already dying in snow-covered wilderness far from home. "Please," the hunter gasped, blood bubbling from his lips as internal damage did its fatal work. "I got a daughter. Same age as that little girl you're protecting. Don't let me die without... Your daughter will grow up without a father because you chose money over morality," Knight Rider said flatly. His voice, stripped of sympathy he might have felt for different circumstances. "Remember that truth as you meet whatever judgment comes next." The man tried to respond, but death claimed him mid-breath, his eyes going glassy as life fled and left only empty flesh behind. Knight Rider stood over the three bodies, feeling nothing resembling the remorse that civilized society claimed should accompany killing. These men had chosen their path when they accepted payment to hunt a woman and child, and their deaths served as message to anyone else Brennan might send. But as Knight Rider began the grim work of disposing of bodies where they wouldn't be easily found, he felt the familiar weight of violence settling into his bones. This was the 4th, 5th, and 6th men he'd killed since leaving his people, and each death added to the collection of ghosts that haunted his dreams and reminded him of what he'd become. Not a warrior fighting for his people's survival, but a solitary killer who'd found new justifications for the violence that came so naturally to his trained hands. The thought sent him spiraling into the dark places in his mind that he usually kept carefully locked away. Questions about whether protecting Carrie and Ruby was genuine morality, or just another excuse to do what he'd always been good at. Dawn was breaking over the canyon rim by the time Knight Rider finished his grim work. 3 graves shallow but sufficient, 3 horses released to find their own way back to civilization. He stood at the canyon entrance, watching sunrise paint the sky in shades of gold and crimson that reminded him of blood and fire. His hands shaking with exhaustion and something deeper that felt like the foundations of his identity cracking. The sound of footsteps behind him made Knight Rider spin with knife drawn, before his conscious mind identified Carrie's limping gait. She stood 20 feet away, having emerged from the hidden cave, despite his explicit instructions to stay concealed. Her face pale but determined as she took in the scene. "You told us to stay hidden until you came for us," she said quietly, her eyes moving across the canyon, noting details that told story of violence and death. "But when you didn't come by dawn, I got scared that—" Her voice broke as understanding flooded through her about what his absence had meant, what he'd been doing through the long, dark hours. "You killed them," Carrie whispered. "Not accusation, but statement of fact. All 3 of them." Knight Rider nodded once, not trusting his voice around the emotions churning in his chest. Carrie moved closer, her damaged feet making her wince with each step, but maternal need to understand overriding physical pain. "Are you hurt?" she asked, her hands reaching toward him before stopping short as if uncertain whether touch would be welcome after what he'd done. Knight Rider looked down at himself, noting blood splatter on his clothes and hands that he'd been too numb to clean. Evidence of violence that painted him as exactly the savage white society claimed his people to be. "None of it's mine," he said flatly. his voice rough from hours of silence and internal warfare. "The men are dead and buried, where they won't be easily found." He paused, forcing himself to meet Carrie's eyes, despite shame that threatened to choke him. "You should take Ruby and leave." Knight Rider continued, the words tasting like poison on his tongue. "I'm not the protector you need. I'm just another killer who found convenient justification for doing what comes naturally." Carrie's expression shifted from concern to something fierce and protective that Knight Rider hadn't expected. "Don't you dare," she said, her voice rising with anger that surprised them both. "Don't you dare try to make yourself the villain after saving our lives." She closed the remaining distance between them, despite the pain each step caused. Her hands finding his blood-stained ones with deliberate intention. "Those men made their choices," Carrie continued, her grip tightening, as if she could physically prevent him from retreating into self-recrimination. "They chose to hunt a child for money, to work for a man who enslaves innocence, to ignore every opportunity to walk away." Her voice cracked with emotion, but she pushed forward. "You gave them chances I never would have," Carrie said fiercely, tears streaming down her face now. "You let them leave, you warned them, and when they refused every opportunity for mercy, you did what had to be done." Knight Rider felt something break inside him at her words. The careful walls he'd built around his guilt and shame crumbling under the weight of her absolute conviction. "I've killed so many people," he whispered, the confession torn from depths he'd never intended to expose. "Soldiers and settlers and anyone who threatened my family. And when I couldn't save them anyway, I thought the killing would stop." His hands turned in Carrie's grip, clutching at her fingers like they were the only solid things in a world that had gone liquid and unstable. "But it never stops," Knight Rider continued, his voice breaking on words he'd never spoken aloud. "The violence just finds new justifications, new targets, new reasons why this time it's different." Carrie pulled him down to her level with surprising strength for someone so recently near death, her hands cupping his face with the kind of fierce tenderness only someone who understood brokenness could offer. "It is different," she insisted, her eyes boring into his with intensity that demanded he believe her. "Those soldiers killed your family for land. You killed these men to protect innocence. Can't you see the difference?" Knight Rider wanted to believe her, wanted to accept the moral distinction she was drawing, but years of internal warfare had taught him that justifications were just stories people told themselves to sleep at night. "What if I'm lying to myself?" he asked, the question emerging from fears he'd never voiced. "What if I'm just using you and Ruby as excuse to keep being what I've always been?" Carrie's hands tightened on his face, her thumbs wiping away tears he hadn't realized were falling. "Then explain Ruby to me," she said quietly, her voice carrying absolute certainty. "Explain how a man who just wanted excuses for violence spends hours teaching a traumatized child to braid her hair." She paused, letting her words sink in before continuing. "Explain how that same man carves spirit animals to honor the dead and treats a desperate stranger with more kindness than anyone's shown her in years," Carrie went on, her voice gaining strength. "Killers don't do those things, Knight Rider. Protectors do." Something in her words penetrated the darkness that had been consuming him. "A lifeline thrown into drowning waters. I don't know how to be anything but a warrior," Knight Rider admitted, his voice raw with vulnerability he'd never allowed himself. "And warriors exist for violence. It's all I was trained for." Carrie's expression softened, understanding flooding through her about the weight of identity and purpose that he'd been carrying. "Then maybe it's time you learned that warriors can also be healers," she said gently, one hand moving from his face to rest over his heart. "That protecting life is just as important as taking it." She leaned forward, pressing her forehead against his in a gesture of intimacy that had nothing to do with romance and everything to do with shared survival. "You gave Ruby and me our lives back," Carrie whispered, her breath warm against his face, "not by killing those men, But by offering shelter when we had nowhere else to go, by treating us like we mattered when the world said we didn't. Knight Rider felt his arms come around her almost involuntarily, pulling her close while his mind struggled to process what she was offering. Not absolution, because that would have been too easy and he didn't deserve it. But acceptance, the recognition that humans were complex creatures, capable of both terrible violence and profound compassion, sometimes in the same breath. They stood like that for long moments. Two broken people holding each other against the weight of everything they'd survived and everything they'd done to survive. When they finally pulled apart, Knight Rider felt something shift in his chest. Not healing exactly, but the beginning of possibility that healing might eventually come. "Ruby's probably terrified," Carrie said softly. Practical maternal concerns reasserting themselves. "We should get back to her before she imagines something worse than reality." Knight Rider nodded, grateful for the return to concrete tasks that didn't require examining the emotional earthquakes still rippling through him. They found Ruby sitting at the cave entrance, her small face tight with the kind of worry that children wore when adults disappeared for too long. "Mama!" Ruby cried, launching herself at Carrie with the desperation of a child who'd been imagining worst possibilities. "You were gone so long and I heard noises and I thought, 'I'm safe, baby girl,'" Carrie murmured, pulling her daughter close while meeting Knight Rider's eyes over Ruby's head. "We're all safe now." Ruby pulled back enough to look at Knight Rider, her young face showing the calculation children made when trying to understand adult realities. "Did you win?" she asked simply, the question carrying layers of meaning about violence and protection and what winning actually meant. Knight Rider knelt to her level, his large hands gentle on her small shoulders. "The bad men won't be hunting you anymore," he said carefully, offering truth without details a 6-year-old didn't need. "But winning doesn't always feel good. Sometimes it just feels necessary." Ruby studied his face with the seriousness she brought to important matters, then surprised him by wrapping her arms around his neck in a fierce hug. "Thank you for keeping us safe even when it made you sad," she whispered against his shoulder. Her child's intuition cutting straight to truths adults tried to hide. Knight Rider's arms came around the small body, and he felt something in his chest crack open completely at her absolute trust despite everything. "You're welcome, little one," he managed, his voice rough with emotions he was only beginning to acknowledge. When Ruby finally released him and returned to her mother's side, Knight Rider stood and faced them both with the kind of determination that came from decisions made and owned. "We need to talk about what comes next," he said, his voice carrying the weight of someone who'd looked into darkness and chosen light despite the cost. "Because 3 dead men will bring questions eventually," Carrie nodded, her hand finding Ruby's with automatic protectiveness. "Brennan will send more," she said, stating the reality they all understood. "He's got too much invested in that work camp to let one escaped child ruin his operation." Knight Rider felt the familiar cold calculation of tactical planning replacing the emotional turmoil of the past hours. "Then we don't wait for him to come to us," he said, the words forming a plan even as he spoke them. "We take the fight to him. Expose what he's doing to authorities who'll actually care." Carrie's eyes widened with hope and fear in equal measure. "You mean go to the territorial marshal?" she asked, her voice rising with the desperate possibility that legal solutions might still exist. "But I tried that before. Nobody believed me over Brennan's paperwork." Knight Rider's expression hardened with the kind of determination that had carried him through countless impossible situations. "They didn't have 3 bodies and a witness willing to testify about what really happens at that camp," he said firmly. "And they didn't have a Blackfoot warrior willing to bring war to their doorstep if justice fails." The threat in his words was clear, a promise that one way or another, Ruby would be free and Brennan would pay for his crimes. Carrie's face showed the war between hope and learned helplessness. Years of disappointment fighting against the possibility that this time might be different. "You'd really do that?" she whispered, her voice breaking on the question. Risk everything to bring him down when you could just send us away and go back to your isolation? Knight Rider met her eyes with absolute certainty. I can't go back, he said simply, the truth of it settling into his bones with the weight of permanence. Whatever I was before you knocked on my camp is gone, burned away by everything that's happened since. He paused, his gaze moving to include Ruby in his next words. You're my family now, Knight Rider continued, the declaration feeling both terrifying and inevitable, which means your fight is my fight, and I don't abandon family. Ruby's face lit up with joy that made the darkness of the past hours seem almost worthwhile. Does that mean we really get to stay forever? She asked, bouncing on her toes despite the morning's fear. And you'll teach me all the things you promised. Knight Rider felt unexpected warmth bloom in his chest, pushing back against the cold darkness that had threatened to consume him. Yes, he said, the single word carrying the weight of commitment. We're a family, and families stay together. As morning light filled the canyon with warmth that promised spring would eventually come despite winter's grip, Knight Rider felt something he thought had died, with his wife and son beginning to stir back to life. Not the same love he'd lost, but something new and equally precious, built from shared survival and chosen connection rather than blood and tradition. The road ahead would be dangerous, filled with threats both known and unexpected. But facing it together seemed possible in ways that surviving alone never had. The Territorial Marshal's office in Laramie sat like a monument to frontier justice, all rough-hewn timber and iron bars, and Knight Rider felt every eye in the street, tracking their unlikely group as they approached the building 3 days after the canyon battle. Carrie walked beside him with Ruby clinging to her hand. Both wearing new clothes purchased from the general store with money Knight Rider had saved from years of trapping, their previous rags having been burned along with the evidence of how far they'd fallen. But it wasn't their clothing that drew stares from townspeople going about their morning business. It was the sight of a Blackfoot warrior walking openly through a white settlement, armed and dangerous despite the relative peace that had settled over the territory. Maybe this was a mistake, Carrie whispered, her free hand finding Knight Rider's arm with nervous pressure. These people look at you like you're the threat, not Brennan. Knight Rider had expected this reaction, had steeled himself against the familiar hatred and fear that white faces showed when confronted with indigenous presence in spaces they'd claimed as exclusively theirs. Let them look, he said quietly, his voice carrying the kind of calm that came from years of navigating hostile territory. Their opinions don't change what needs to be done. Ruby squeezed her mother's hand, her young face showing the brave determination she'd adopted since the canyon battle, as if surviving that night had transformed her understanding of what courage actually meant. I'm not scared anymore, Ruby announced, with the absolute conviction only children could muster. Because Knight Rider promised nobody would hurt us, and he keeps his promises. The simple faith in her words made something warm bloom in Knight Rider's chest, despite the cold reception they were receiving from the town. Marshal William Crawford looked up from his desk as they entered, his weathered face showing the kind of wary assessment lawmen developed after years of dealing with frontier complications. He was older than Knight Rider expected, probably pushing 60, with grey threading through his beard and scars that spoke of a younger man's violent encounters with outlaws and hostile tribes. We don't allow Indians in town without proper escort, Crawford said flatly, his hand moving toward the rifle propped against his desk with practiced casualness. Territorial law says a lot of things, Knight Rider interrupted, his voice carrying the kind of authority that made the marshal pause mid-reach, including that children can't be sold into forced labor under the guise of orphanage placement. Crawford's eyes narrowed, his attention shifting from Knight Rider to Carrie and Ruby with renewed interest. Mrs. Walsh, the marshal said slowly, recognition dawning across his features. Jacob Brennan filed a report 3 weeks ago claiming you kidnapped your daughter from his legally operated children's home. Carrie's face went white at the mention of Brennan's name. but she lifted her chin with that stubborn pride Knight Rider had come to admire. "He's a liar," she said clearly, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "That facility isn't a children's home. It's a work camp where kids are exploited for factory labor under conditions that would make grown men weep." Crawford leaned back in his chair, his expression shifting from hostile suspicion to something approaching professional interest. "That's a serious accusation, Mom," he said carefully. "One that would require substantial evidence to pursue, given Brennan's standing in the business community." Knight Rider felt cold anger settle in his chest at the implication that a child's testimony and mother's word weren't sufficient evidence against a man with money and connections. "I've got 3 dead men buried in a canyon who came hunting this woman and child on Brennan's orders," Knight Rider said flatly, watching Crawford's face carefully for reaction. "Seems like evidence enough that he's willing to employ killers to maintain his operation." The marshal's hand did move to his rifle then, lifting it with deliberate slowness as his eyes hardened with the recognition of implied confession. "You're admitting to murder?" Crawford asked, his voice dropping to the dangerous quiet of someone preparing for violence. "In my office, with witnesses present," Ruby made a small sound of distress, pressing closer to her mother as the tension in the room escalated toward breaking point. Knight Rider raised his hands slowly, showing empty palms, while his mind calculated distances and angles should this conversation deteriorate into bloodshed. "I'm admitting to defense of innocence," he corrected, his voice carrying the distinction clearly. 3 armed men came to my camp intending to kidnap a child and kill anyone who interfered." He paused, letting his words settle before continuing with deliberate emphasis. "Territorial law is pretty clear about a man's right to defend his property and family from violent intrusion," Knight Rider went on, meeting Crawford's eyes without flinching. "Which is exactly what I did." The marshal was quiet for a long moment, his rifle still held ready but not quite aimed, his expression showing the internal calculation lawmen made when letter of law conflicted with spirit of justice. "The men have names?" Crawford asked finally, his tone suggesting he was at least willing to hear the full story before making arrest decisions. Knight Rider recited the names he'd found on papers carried by the dead men, details that would allow verification of their employment and character. Crawford's expression shifted as he heard the second name, recognition and disgust crossing his weathered features in equal measure. "Jack Morrison," the marshal said heavily, setting his rifle down with the air of someone who just had suspicions confirmed. "We've had reports about him for years. A bounty hunter who wasn't particular about which side of the law his targets fell on." As he stood, moving to a filing cabinet with purposeful strides that suggested this conversation had taken a turn Knight Rider hadn't anticipated. Morrison was suspected in at least 4 disappearances of women and children over the past 2 years, Crawford continued, pulling files that he spread across his desk with grim efficiency, all of them fitting the pattern of Brennan's recruitment for that facility of his. Carrie's hand flew to her mouth, understanding flooding through her about how close they'd come to becoming another set of missing persons. Nobody bothered investigating. "You knew," she breathed, accusation creeping into her voice despite her obvious fear. "You knew what Brennan was doing, and you didn't stop him." Crawford's face hardened with the defensive anger of someone confronting their own failures. "Knowing and proving are different things in territorial law," he said sharply, his frustration evident. "Brennan's got lawyers from back east, connections to mining interests that fund half the territorial government." He paused, his expression showing the bitter reality of frontier justice, where money bought protection from consequences. "Every time we got close to building a case, witnesses disappeared or recanted," Crawford continued, slamming his hand on the desk with suppressed rage. "Families too scared to testify, officials too corrupt to care." Knight Rider felt something shift in his assessment of the marshal, recognizing a man trapped between duty and political reality. "Then here's your chance to finally act," he said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of someone offering an alliance rather than making demands. A witness willing to testify, physical evidence of violent enforcement, and someone who doesn't scare easily standing beside her. Crawford studied Knight Rider with renewed interest, seeing past the surface threat to the strategic mind underneath. "You understand what you're proposing," the marshal said slowly. "Testifying against Brennan means painting a target on all your backs, means facing lawyers who'll tear apart every aspect of your character and history." His eyes moved to Carrie with something approaching sympathy. "They'll call you an unfit mother who abandoned your child," Crawford warned, his tone making clear this wasn't speculation, but certainty. "They'll claim you're an immoral woman who seduced this warrior into helping you cover up your own crimes." Carrie's face flushed with anger and humiliation at the accusations she knew were coming. But her voice remained steady. "Let them say what they want," she replied fiercely, her arm wrapping protectively around Ruby's shoulders. "I've survived worse than cruel words, and my daughter deserves justice even if it costs me everything." Ruby looked up at her mother with the kind of fierce pride children showed when they realized their parents were capable of extraordinary courage. "I'll tell them what it was really like," Ruby offered, her small voice carrying unexpected strength. "I'll tell them about the machines that hurt my hands and the man who hit me when I cried." Crawford's expression softened slightly at the child's determination, and Knight Rider saw the moment the marshal made his decision. "All right," Crawford said heavily, settling back into his chair with the air of someone committing to a course of action that would bring him nothing but trouble. "I'll ride out to the canyon tomorrow, document the scene, and file official reports." He paused, his eyes moving between the three of them, with warning written clear across his face. "But you need to understand something," Crawford continued, his voice dropping to serious gravity. "Brennan's not just going to roll over because we've got evidence. Men like him fight dirty when cornered." Knight Rider nodded, having expected nothing less from someone who'd built an empire on exploiting the vulnerable. "Then we fight dirtier," he said simply, his words carrying the promise of violence held in reserve but ready to deploy if legal channels failed. Crawford studied him for a long moment, then nodded with the understanding of one warrior recognizing another. "Stay at the boarding house on Main Street," the marshal instructed, his tone shifting to practical logistics. "I'll arrange protection while we build the case, but keep your weapons close and your backs to walls." As they left the marshal's office, Knight Rider felt the weight of what they'd just set in motion settling into his bones. They'd crossed a line from survival into active warfare against an enemy with resources and connections they couldn't match directly. But walking through the hostile streets with Carrie's hand, finding his and Ruby's small form pressed against his side, Knight Rider felt something he hadn't experienced in years, purpose beyond mere survival. A reason to fight that extended past personal vengeance into something approaching justice. The boarding house Crawford had recommended was run by a widow named Martha Chen, whose weathered face and capable hands spoke of frontier resilience that transcended racial boundaries. She took one look at their unlikely family and seemed to understand everything that mattered without requiring explanations. "Rooms are $2 a night," Mrs. Chen said briskly, her eyes lingering on Ruby's too thin frame with maternal concern. "Dinner's included, and anyone who bothers my guests answers to me and my shotgun." The casual way she included Knight Rider in her protection made something loosen in his chest that he hadn't realized was tight. That night, lying in a real bed for the first time in weeks, Carrie finally allowed herself to believe they might actually survive what was coming. Ruby slept between them, her small body relaxed in ways it hadn't been since before the work camp, and Knight Rider found himself watching over them both with fierce protectiveness. "Thank you," Carrie whispered into the darkness, her voice barely audible over Ruby's soft breathing, "for everything you've done, everything you're still doing." Knight Rider was quiet for a moment, searching for words to explain what these two people had come to mean to him. "You gave me something to protect again," he said finally. His voice rough with emotion, he was still learning to express. "Something worth the risk of caring." Carrie's hand found his across Ruby's sleeping form, their fingers intertwining with the kind of intimacy that had nothing to do with romance and everything to do with shared survival. "We're going to win this," she said with fierce conviction, "because we have to. Because Ruby deserves a childhood and you deserve peace." Knight Rider squeezed her hand gently, wanting to believe her certainty, even as his warrior's mind calculated the 1,000 ways their plan could fail. But lying there in the darkness with his chosen family breathing softly beside him, Knight Rider allowed himself to hope that justice might actually prevail, that the powerful could be held accountable, that families formed by choice rather than blood could be just as real. Outside, the town of Laramie settled into night's quiet rhythm, unaware that the foundations of one man's corrupt empire were beginning to crack. And in a canyon 3 days' ride away, shallow graves held silent testimony to the cost of threatening people who'd finally found something worth fighting for. Morning would bring new challenges, legal battles that would test them in ways different from physical violence. But for now, in this moment of peace stolen from the chaos surrounding them, Knight Rider allowed himself to simply be not a warrior, not a killer, not a man defined by loss and grief, but a protector, a chosen father, a member of a family that had found each other against impossible odds, and that, he thought as sleep finally claimed him, was worth every risk they were taking. The trial lasted 3 weeks, and by the end of the first day, Carrie understood that justice in frontier territories had less to do with truth than with who could afford the better lawyers. Brennan sat at the defendant's table wearing expensive suits and practiced expressions of wounded innocence, flanked by attorneys from Denver who spoke in polished tones about charitable work and misunderstood intentions. Meanwhile, Carrie took the stand in her borrowed dress, facing questions designed to paint her as an unstable woman whose word couldn't be trusted against a respected businessman. "Mrs. Walsh," Brennan's lead attorney began, his voice dripping with false sympathy, "isn't it true that after your husband's death, you became unable to properly care for your daughter?" The question was designed to trap her into admitting failure. But Carrie had learned something about courage from watching Knight Rider face his demons. "What's true is that I lost my home and my income," she replied firmly, meeting the attorney's eyes without flinching. "But I never stopped being Ruby's mother, never stopped fighting to keep her safe." Knight Rider watched from the gallery as the attorney tried to use Carrie's desperation against her, his hands clenching into fists at the casual cruelty of twisting maternal love into weakness. But Carrie lifted her chin with that stubborn pride he'd come to love, refusing to let shame silence her truth. "I signed those papers because a man I trusted told me it was a school," she said clearly, her voice carrying to every corner of the packed courtroom. "What I found was a factory floor where my 6-year-old daughter had bruises from being beaten and hands bleeding from machinery." The courtroom erupted in whispers. But Marshal Crawford stood then, producing files that made Brennan's composure crack. "We have testimony from 23 other families," Crawford announced, his voice cutting through the noise, all describing similar conditions, all afraid to come forward until Mrs. Walsh showed them courage was possible. Ruby took the stand on the trial's 8th day, her small form dwarfed by the witness chair, but her voice carrying clearly as she pointed at Brennan with the directness only children possessed. "The man hit me when I cried for my mama," she said simply. "And he said children who didn't work hard enough didn't deserve to eat." The jury deliberated for 2 days. And when they returned with guilty verdicts on 12 counts of child endangerment and fraud, the courtroom erupted in cheers that spoke of justice too long delayed. Brennan was sentenced to 15 years in territorial prison, his assets seized to provide restitution to families he'd exploited. Knight Rider stood outside the courthouse, watching Carrie hold Ruby close, while other families approached to thank them for their courage. and he felt something fundamental shift in his understanding of what warrior meant. The wedding happened 6 weeks later, though the path to that day proved more complicated than any of them expected. Ruby woke screaming from nightmares 3 nights out of 7, her small body rigid with terror as she relived the work camp in dreams that wouldn't release their grip. Knight Rider would find Carrie sitting in Ruby's room at 2 in the morning, both of them exhausted but unable to sleep, and he'd join them without being asked. "I thought winning would make it stop," Carrie whispered one particularly difficult night, her voice breaking as Ruby finally fell back into fitful sleep. "I thought justice would heal her." Knight Rider pulled Carrie close, understanding in ways he wished he didn't, that trauma didn't disappear just because the threat was gone. "Healing isn't a straight line," he said quietly, thinking of his own years of nightmares after losing his family. "Some wounds need time to close, and some scars never quite fade." Carrie turned in his arms, her face showing the exhaustion of a mother watching her child suffer without being able to fix it. "What if I've ruined her?" she asked, the fear she'd been holding finally breaking free. "What if taking her to that place broke something that can't be repaired?" Knight Rider cupped her face with gentle hands, forcing her to meet his eyes in the dim light. "You didn't break her," he said firmly. "Brennan did, and you're the one helping her heal by being here, by not pretending the trauma didn't happen." He paused, searching for words to explain something he'd learned through his own painful journey. "Ruby's going to carry scars from this," Knight Rider continued, his voice rough with honesty. "But scars don't mean broken, they mean survived. And with us beside her, she'll learn that survival can become strength." The wedding ceremony was small and simple. Marshal Crawford officiating in the courthouse with Mrs. Chen and a handful of families they'd helped standing as witnesses. Ruby insisted on being Flower Girl despite the dark circles under her eyes from another nightmare the previous night. Her determination to participate in joy despite lingering pain, making Knight Rider's chest ache with pride. When it came time for vows, Knight Rider spoke in both Blackfoot and English, his voice carrying the weight of promises he intended to keep. "I promise to protect you both," he said, meeting Carrie's tear-filled eyes before looking down at Ruby standing between them. "Not just from outside threats, but from the lies trauma tells us about our worth." He knelt to Ruby's level, his large hands gentle on her small shoulders. "I promise that nightmares don't make you weak," Knight Rider continued, speaking to her directly, "and crying doesn't make you less brave. You're the strongest person I've ever known." Ruby's lip trembled, but she didn't cry, nodding with the seriousness she brought to important moments. Carrie's vows were simpler, but carried their own power. "I promise to let you help carry the weight," she said to Knight Rider, her voice steady despite tears. "To stop pretending I can do everything alone." She looked down at Ruby, smoothing her daughter's hair with infinite tenderness. "And I promise to believe you when you tell me you're scared," Carrie said to her daughter, "to never make you hide your pain to protect my feelings." The months that followed taught them all that building a family from broken pieces required patience and grace they didn't always possess. Knight Rider's new work tracking missing children sometimes triggered his own trauma, sending him into dark moods where Carrie had to coax him back to the present. Carrie's seamstress shop struggled at first, her hands shaking too badly some days to thread needles, frustration bringing tears she tried to hide. Ruby had good days where she laughed and played like any child, and bad days where she couldn't bear anyone touching her without flinching. But they learned to navigate these challenges together, to offer grace when someone struggled and accept help when they needed it. One evening, 6 months after the wedding, Knight Rider returned from a difficult case to find Ruby teaching neighborhood children a hand game he'd shown her. She was laughing, genuinely laughing, in a way he hadn't heard since before the trial. Carrie sat on the porch with her sewing, and when she saw him, her smile carried the kind of peace that came from hard-won progress, rather than easy perfection. "She had a whole week without nightmares," Carrie said softly as Knight Rider settled beside her. Dr. Morrison says that's real progress. Knight Rider watched Ruby play, noting how she still positioned herself where she could see all exits, how she still checked periodically to ensure her mother was visible. The trauma hadn't disappeared, but it was loosening its grip. "I lost it yesterday," Carrie admitted quietly, her hands stilling on her sewing. "A customer complained about a delayed order, and I just broke down crying in the shop." She laughed bitterly, shaking her head at her own perceived weakness. Knight Rider took her hand, his thumb tracing circles on her palm with the patient comfort that had become their language. "I had nightmares 3 times this week," he confessed, offering his own vulnerability in exchange for hers. "Woke up reaching for weapons that weren't there. Convinced my family was under attack." Carrie's eyes found his, and in them he saw understanding that went deeper than words. "We're all still healing," she said, not as excuse but as acknowledgement of reality. Ruby ran toward them then, her face flushed with exertion and joy, throwing herself into Knight Rider's arms with the trust that had taken months to fully rebuild. "Papa, will you tell us the story about the wolf and the moon?" she asked, using the title she'd adopted gradually, testing it first with hesitation, then with growing confidence. Knight Rider felt his heart clench at the word papa, still not quite used to the gift of being claimed by this remarkable child. "Which version?" he asked, settling Ruby on his lap while Carrie leaned against his shoulder. "The one where the wolf learns to howl, or the one where he learns to listen?" "The listening one," Ruby said immediately, a small hand finding his with the casual affection that spoke of safety finally taking root. "Because that's the one about family." As twilight painted the sky in shades of purple and gold, Knight Rider told the story his grandmother had told him as a child, about a lone wolf who thought solitude was strength until he learned that true power came from connection. Ruby's eyes grew heavy as the story continued, her body relaxing completely against him in a way that still felt miraculous, given how tense she'd been for so long. When she finally fell asleep, Carrie helped carry her inside, and they tucked her into bed with the night lamp burning low because complete darkness still frightened her. Standing in the doorway watching Ruby sleep peacefully for once, Knight Rider felt Carrie's hand slip into his. "It's not perfect," she whispered, voicing the thought they'd both been having. "We're all still carrying damage, still figuring out how to be a family." Knight Rider turned to face her, his free hand cupping her cheek with the gentleness that had replaced his earlier roughness. "Perfect would be boring," he said, a small smile tugging at his mouth. "We're real, we're healing, and we're choosing each other every day, despite how hard it is." Carrie rose on her toes, pressing a kiss to his lips that tasted of tears and hope in equal measure. "I love you," she breathed against his mouth, "for seeing my broken pieces and loving me anyway." "I love you for the same reason," Knight Rider replied, pulling her close, "and for showing me that broken doesn't mean worthless." They stood in the quiet house they'd built together, scarred but standing, wounded but healing, imperfect but trying, and that, Knight Rider thought as he held his wife close, was the truest kind of victory, not the absence of pain, but the presence of people willing to face it together, not the erasure of trauma, but the slow, difficult work of building something beautiful from its aftermath. They were a family now, bound by choice and courage, and the daily decision to keep showing up for each other, and that was enough. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.